You complain when your thermostat drops 2 degrees. Somewhere on this planet, 40,000 years ago, a person watched the first snow of the season fall and understood something you never have to think about. The next 6 months, we're going to try to kill them, slowly, one cold night at a time. No heating, no stockpiled grocery run, no synthetic jacket rated for -20, just a body, a fire that could fail, and whatever the group had managed to figure out the winter before. Here's the part that doesn't get said enough. Winter wasn't an inconvenience for ancient humans, it was a filter. Entire groups didn't make it through, and the ones who did weren't lucky. They were the ones who had solved a series of brutal, unglamorous problems that never show up in the version of prehistory most people picture. Start with the coldest, hardest fact first. Fat mattered more than muscle. Modern fitness culture worships lean bodies. Ancient winter had the opposite standard, and it wasn't aesthetic, it was arithmetic. A human body needs a baseline number of calories just to keep its internal temperature above the line where organs start failing. In deep winter, hunting success drops. Plant food disappears under snow. The gap between what the body burns and what the environment provides has to come from somewhere, and stored fat is the only bank account that pays out when everything else is closed. This is almost certainly why the so-called Venus figurines, small carved statues found across Ice Age Europe, some dating back over 30,000 years, consistently depict wide hips, heavy thighs, and substantial body fat. For decades, this got filed under fertility symbolism, and it may well carry that meaning too. But researchers looking at the geography of where these figurines actually turn up have noticed something specific. The heaviest, most exaggerated figures cluster in the coldest region, the ones with the harshest winters and the longest stretches without reliable food. Fertility and survival weren't separate ideas to people living that close to the edge. A body that could store enough fat to survive winter was also a body capable of carrying a pregnancy through it. The two things were the same body doing the same impossible job, which meant the final weeks before winter functioned as a deliberate campaign. Groups gorged. Not casually, deliberately, methodically on anything calorie-dense they could get their hands on, particularly fat itself. Marrow cracked from bone, blubber from marine mammals in coastal regions. Whatever the landscape offered that packed the most energy into the smallest amount of food. This wasn't excess, it was the only insurance policy available. Then there's the part almost nobody wants to picture. But archaeologists can't avoid it because the bones don't lie about it. When food ran out completely and starvation became the immediate threat rather than the abstract one, some groups turned to survival cannibalism. This isn't speculation built on rumor. At the Gough's cave site in England, roughly 15,000 years old, researchers found human bones bearing precise cut marks, the same marks you'd expect from any animal being butchered for meat. Not ritual damage, not violence between rivals, careful, practiced defleshing, consistent with a group extracting every available calorie from a body that could no longer object. Some of the bones had even been shaped into cups. The instinct is to recoil from this, and that's a reasonable instinct. But sit with what it actually represents for a moment. These were people who had exhausted every other option first. The animals had already been hunted. The stored fat had already been eaten. The last resort had genuinely become the only resort. This wasn't monstrous behavior in the way modern imagination frames it. It was a species doing the absolute last thing biology allows a body to do in order to keep other bodies alive one more week. Shelter posed its own brutal calculus because the obvious solution, build something bigger and stronger, was often the wrong one entirely. At sites in what's now Ukraine and Russia, dating back roughly 20,000 years, archaeologists have found circular structures built almost entirely from mammoth bones. Skulls stacked as a foundation, massive leg bones arranged as structural framing, tusks curved into archways. This wasn't an aesthetic choice or a display of hunting prowess. In a landscape without significant trees, mammoth bone was often the only building material dense and sturdy enough to survive brutal wind loads. But the genuinely counterintuitive engineering decision was size. These shelters were kept deliberately small, barely large enough for a family to fit inside, hunched together. That wasn't a failure of ambition. It was thermodynamics understood through hard experience, generations before anyone had a word for the concept. Every cubic foot of enclosed air is space that needs to be warmed and then needs to stay warmed. A larger structure means more surface area losing heat to the outside, and a fire has to work exponentially harder to compensate. Small and human bodies packed close together wasn't a compromise forced by limited resources. It was frequently the smartest possible engineering response available. Inside those cramped shelters sat the single object standing between a family and death: fire. And fire during an Ice Age winter wasn't simple warmth. It was full-time, high-stakes labor. Modern matches ignite in under a second. Ancient fire starting, using nothing but a wooden drill spun by hand or a striking stone against pyrite, could take minutes of sustained, exhausting physical effort. And that's assuming perfectly dry material, which winter rarely provided. This is precisely why groups treated fire less like a tool you make when needed, and more like a living thing that never got permitted to fully die. Someone was almost always assigned to the fire specifically, feeding it, shielding it from wind, waking through the night to check it. Losing the flame during a brutal cold snap wasn't a minor setback. It could mean death for everyone sheltering around it before a new one could realistically be started. Archaeological evidence from sites across Ice Age Europe shows fires that were clearly maintained continuously for extended periods. Thick, uninterrupted ash layers stacked in unbroken sequence, rather than the scattered, repeatedly relit fire pits typical of warmer seasons and easier conditions. The fire wasn't an activity, it was infrastructure, and someone's entire winter job was keeping that infrastructure alive. Clothing carried the same brutal stakes, and this is where Neanderthals reveal something genuinely unsettling about the limits of adaptation. Despite roughly 400,000 years of exposure to cold European climates, Neanderthal populations show comparatively little evidence of the sophisticated-eyed needles and tightly fitted, layered clothing that shows up consistently at anatomically modern human sites from the same era and same brutal climate. That gap in the archaeological record isn't a minor detail. It's a leading theory for why Neanderthals eventually vanished while modern humans, arriving in the same unforgiving landscape, survived and expanded. It wasn't necessarily brain size or raw physical strength that made the decisive difference. It may have come down to something as unglamorous as who could sew a properly fitted, wind-resistant garment and who was still relying on loosely draped hides. Modern humans had bone needles with genuinely tiny eyes, dating back at least 40,000 years, engineered specifically for fine sinew thread. This allowed layered clothing systems, an inner layer trapping warm air directly against skin, an outer layer built specifically to block wind. That air gap between the layers wasn't incidental. It's the same fundamental engineering principle behind every modern down jacket ever manufactured, discovered by people working entirely with bone, hide, and raw persistence. There's a specific, almost eerie detail from the burial of 2 children at Sunghir in Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago. Thousands of small ivory beads were found meticulously arranged in patterns across their bodies. Patterns that only make sense as decoration sewn directly onto tightly fitted clothing that has long since decomposed entirely. Archaeologists were essentially able to reconstruct the shape and cut of complete winter garments purely from where thousands of beads had fallen once the fabric and hide beneath them rotted away over tens of thousands of years. Food storage brought its own quiet ingenuity, developed without refrigeration, without salt in reliable supply, without any of the preservation tools we take for granted today. The primary strategy was elegantly simple. Let the environment itself do the preserving. Permafrost and consistently frozen ground functioned as a natural freezer. Groups dug storage pits specifically to exploit this, caching meat in the frozen earth where bacteria simply couldn't function well enough to spoil it. Some of these ancient storage pits, when excavated by modern researchers, still held identifiable, well-preserved bone fragments from meat cached tens of thousands of years earlier. Beyond frozen ground storage, drying and smoking meat over a low fire pulled out enough moisture to prevent bacterial growth for months at a stretch, extending a single successful hunt across weeks that would otherwise have meant slow starvation. But surviving winter took more than fire, fat, and clothing. It took information. the accumulated kind that lives entirely in memory and dies the moment nobody's left alive to pass it on. Which specific frozen lake surface would reliably hold a person's weight and which one wouldn't? Where a particular herd predictably sheltered during a specific type of storm. Precisely how many days of stored fat a family actually needed banked before the first real snowfall arrived. None of this got written down anywhere because writing didn't exist yet. It lived entirely inside the oldest members of the group, which is very likely one clear reason elders were protected and fed even after their bodies could no longer contribute physical labor. Losing an elder in the depths of winter wasn't only a loss of companionship. It was losing an entire irreplaceable survival manual that existed nowhere else on Earth. This is also very likely why humans developed such a deep, almost desperate relationship with storytelling and myth around fire, specifically during the darkest, coldest months. Long winter nights, trapped together in cramped shelters with genuinely nothing else to occupy restless minds, created ideal conditions for oral tradition to calcify into something closer to religion. Stories about the sun's eventual, promised return. Rituals timed precisely to the winter solstice, marking the single longest night as the definitive turning point. The moment when things would slowly, finally start getting better. Some researchers argue these weren't simply cultural decoration layered on top of survival. They may have functioned as genuine psychological survival tools in their own right, something that gave people a concrete, believable reason to keep enduring one more freezing week when every single physical sign around them suggested things were only going to get worse before spring finally arrived. Winter didn't just test ancient humans physically, it tested every single system they had, their engineering, their social structures, their capacity to plan months into an uncertain future, and their ability to hold onto hope through actual, literal darkness. The ones who survived weren't the strongest individuals in any simple sense. They were the ones embedded in groups that had figured out fire, fat, clothing, shelter, storage, and knowledge transfer, and had woven all of it together into something resembling a system. One where losing any single piece could genuinely mean losing everyone. Every single person alive on this planet right now descends directly from people who made it through winters exactly like this one, year after year, for tens of thousands of consecutive years, with absolutely no guarantee that the next one wouldn't finally be the one that broke them. Next time the temperature drops and you reach for a thermostat, that's what's actually standing behind you.